So, ja, sehr schön. Liebe Teilnehmerinnen und Teilnehmer, es geht weiter mit dem Vortrag von Dr. Delon Human. Er ist Gründer der Health Diplomats, eine große internationale Gesellschaft, die tatsächlich eine global arbeitende Consulting-Gruppe, die sich spezialisiert hat auf die Kontrolle von Alkohol, Tabak, Drogen und Lebensmittelschadensminimierung und Zugang zu Pflege. Dr. Delon Human wird tatsächlich sprechen über Reset. Reset ist angelehnt an Empower, das war ein Werkzeug zur besseren Tabakkontrolle, ein Vorschlag, wie man im Grunde genommen mit ENDS, also Electronic Nicotine Device Systems, weiterkommt. Und da freue ich mich sehr, dass er dieses Reset vorstellen wird. Dr. Delon wird Englisch sprechen. Für eventuelle Übersetzungen, glaube ich, oder Fragen steht uns der Chat bereit. Aber es ist etwas, was sehr leicht verständlich ist. Also ich freue mich sehr, Dr. Delon hier zu haben und über Reset sprechen zu können. Nice to have you here, Delon, we are very keen to listen to your proposal of reset and how the five letters are, let's say, referred to. Please take the floor, Dr.
Thank you. Okay, can you see the slide properly?
Yes, we can see it, but I think there should be a presentation mode.
Yes, I just want to make sure.
At the moment, we see the big picture and a small picture besides. I think it's yes. And,
right.
And one more. Now we see on the left side the slides you're going to present, but not the presentation mode. Is there another possibility?
I'll quickly see if we can get that. Is that better?
No, that's the one we had before.
Oh, okay. My apologies. Maybe we should. Can you see the slide this way?
We can see it.
Why don't we, just to save time, I just want to first herzlichen Dank für die Einladung, Heino. Herr Stöver. Deutsch ist eine schöne Sprache.
Okay.
Aber für Präzision verzeihen Sie mir auf Englisch zu sprechen. It's really a great privilege to be here and to perhaps just reflect with you on where we stand in the whole battle against smoking, which we know will kill 1 billion people. And all of our talks start more or less the same. We present the problem of a total number of smokers of 1 billion or more, and 1 billion deaths expected in the 21st century. And we are not much closer to a solution, which is highly frustrating. So what I would like to just reflect on is where we stand at the moment in the bigger picture, where it seems like we have it's like a tribal warfare between tobacco control on the one side and tobacco harm reduction on the other. It seems as if the message in tobacco control is all focused on harm. There's always the focus on banning or regulating anything to do with tobacco, even non-combustibles. And you have this message being led by WHO, by most of the groups and individuals funded by Bloomberg. And the narrative is always focused on youth use, the nicotine and its danger and addiction, the fact that it's not really helping to tobacco harm reductions, or not really helping for smoking cessation. And there's more of a medicalization and extreme taxation of all products that have a nicotine base. This group I'm quite familiar with is more on the side of the tobacco harm reduction, which is a complement, as we all see it, to tobacco control, where we look at the benefits of non-combustible nicotine alternatives. We want to make sure that policy is evidence-based and that you don't have biased evidence seeking to scare consumers about the role of non-combustibles. And we have several advocates, scientists, or associations that are working in this field pressing the narrative of we want to save lives, we want to prevent tobacco-related disease, we want to make sure that adult smokers have a chance to stop smoking. So the issue, if you look at the two tribes, is really about combustion and the failure to differentiate between combustible products and non-combustible products. And this is where harm reduction comes in, which I know most of us are familiar with and most of us support. And why is it important? Because it can help to overturn the quit or die strategy, where if you expect an adult smoker just to quit because you advise them to do so, for me as a physician, we know that 8 of 10 of those adult smokers will not be able to quit. And if they were able to switch and have some sort of halfway house, they can reduce harm and escape smoking at the same time. And it's not as if we don't have many examples of harm reduction. We know about seat belts, we know about helmets, condoms, so it's an embedded practice in public health. But when it comes to tobacco control and tobacco harm reduction and the interface between policy, science, the products, and the consumers, it seems that we fall in a ditch. We cannot come forward with risk proportionate, sensible regulation. And that's really what I would like to just, in the next 15 minutes, talk to you about the reset. Now, I'm a veteran in tobacco control, and we were frustrated some 20 years ago when tobacco control wasn't moving fast enough. And then at the time, Empower was created, which was a tool to accelerate tobacco control. And in a sense, this is exactly what we would like to do with Reset. And we applaud the work that you are doing at your university. And we hope that this drive can be replicated and advocated all over the world. In short, Reset would be to advise, advocate, encourage regulators to firstly look at risk-based regulation and make the big distinction between combustibles and non-combustibles. The E stands for ensuring intended use, which is essentially to make sure that youth is prevented to initiate or start smoking or vaping or using tobacco harm reduction products for that matter. The S is for safety, because if consumer safety is not ensured for the non-combustible products, then it's no better than combustible. So that differentiation needs to be assured by safety and quality testing. We live in a world where environmental considerations are extremely important. So that's the E of ESET. And then the T is for tax and traceability. You want to make sure that the manufacturers of these products, and just to be quite clear, don't have shares and don't sell any of these products. I'm a scientist and a physician. You would like all of these products to be traceable so that if there's an issue, it can be followed up. I'll return to the Reset slide, but just to give some more background, we all know that risk differentiation in developing this kind of sound regulation is key. And David Nutt and the scientists that presented this risk differentiation between cigarettes on the left-hand side with let's say, a harm factor of 100%. We know that 1 out of 2 adult smokers will die or have preventable disease from tobacco-related disease. So we know that's the most harm. And then the least harm is on the end of electronic nicotine delivery systems, nasal sprays, oral nicotine pouches. And somehow we've not, if you look at countries' regulatory structures and frameworks, very few countries have this differentiation embedded. So moving on to the type of products, we know that you can basically divide it into nicotine-based or tobacco-based and combustible and non-combustible. And again, in most countries, these categories are not well defined. And that's really what Reset is calling for, is to have categories that are clearly characterized products and where the consumer and the regulator both have the chance to evaluate these products in terms of its harmful nature or not. Just moving on to the principles behind regulation is we know vaping is less harmful. We don't have to go into detail about that. We already have vaping around for 10 to 12 years. in Germany, in the UK, in France, in New Zealand, in Canada, quite clear that there's much less harm, and this is almost becoming a consensus point. We know that where we started, that there's at least a 5% that the damage or harm associated with tobacco harm reduction product will not exceed 5% of those with combustibles. And that really should be reflected in regulation, but the question is it reflected? The answer at this stage is still no. Another key point in developing regulation, especially for myself as a physician, is you want regulation to support the adult smoker's quest to quit smoking. And we, at the beginning of e-cigarettes especially, it was always the counter argument that there's no evidence that e-cigarettes can help adult smokers quit. And the randomized controlled trials by Hayek et al. And Jackson have shown that this is indeed so. So we also know that in the UK that e-cigarette use is the most used product in the UK for quitting. So these are all facts that we all know. What is more worrying is that in terms of misinformation, misinformation is like a cancer to any good regulation. And if you get the situation where the knowledge and perception of nicotine amongst physicians is that it's linked to cancer, which is completely false and not fact-based, this is a serious situation. So we want to make sure that regulations loosely based on the reset principles would make sure that there are no misperceptions about nicotine, which is not a killer, not a carcinogen. It is the combustion that kills and not the nicotine. And we know that nicotine in the form of nicotine replacement therapy has been around for 40 years and no issue. So this playing on fear and the lack of good regulation is leading to a situation where you can get these type of images where worms is associated with vaping products or nicotine, which is completely false. It's scaremongering, and it's not helpful. So you find a situation that multiple consumer perception studies which show that consumers are unsure about these products. They are fearful that they might be substituting one addiction with another. And the only way to fix that is for regulation to be aligned with good evidence and good practice. So we know that regulators are basically very simplistic in how they view regulatory frameworks. They want to assure safety, efficacy, the performance, understand the performance of these products and its quality. And a second important point is that in fact, under the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, harm reduction strategies is embedded in Article 1D. So if we look at the issues that regulators have to address, we've had the so-called teen vaping crisis in the US, which has now clearly been shown has probably been overstated. EVALI was a complete misnomer. There was no e-cigarette or nicotine-based e-cigarettes involved there. We've had the issue of environmental issues, and then the track and trace, the authenticity of products. So these are key regulatory drivers that have to be addressed. Now, as I mentioned, when we were battling in tobacco control, we used Empower to help accelerate the efficacy of tobacco control regulation. Empower was used to, M was the monitoring of tobacco use, P was to protect people from secondary smoke, offered to help people quit tobacco use. The W was to warn about the dangers of tobacco. E was the enforcement of bans on advertising, and R was to raise taxes. So in essence, what we want to do with Reset is to accelerate tobacco harm reduction so that under risk-based regulation, if all regulation of tobacco and nicotine products can clearly differentiate based on risk, and that can make sure that the labeling, packaging, and promotion of these categories of products are evidence-based and clear to the consumer. The E is to ensure the intended use of the product and to avoid the unintended use by youth, for instance, and to make sure that consumers can't tamper with the devices and then another EVALI could take place. The S for safety and quality is in many countries, and I myself involved in Asia and Africa with some governments, where we're trying to develop product standards that are equivalent to the EU Tobacco Product Directive standards, which are essential to give confidence to consumers when they use these products. And then to have testing and post-marketing surveillance to make sure that there aren't any problems after its life cycle in the use by consumers. The E is to make sure that the environmental considerations are well addressed, to make sure that the whole cycle, the life cycle of electronic nicotine delivery systems are well managed, and that it aligns with the so-called environmental, social, and governance standards that are fast evolving. And then lastly, as I mentioned, the T is actually quite important, because we always understood that if you wanted a consumer to move, you raise taxes, or if you want them to move away from a certain category of product, you raise taxes. So it's extremely important that taxation is risk proportionate, the same with labeling, with marketing, with communication, so that as we saw with COVID, consumers and the public want to have confidence in their public health regulatory frameworks, because that helps to save lives in simple terms. And that's really where Reset comes in. Professor Sturver and his unit at Frankfurt University is already working on parts of the Reset, which is fantastic. It's the ideal Germany, and especially Frankfurt and the University for Applied Science is absolutely the ideal spot for an application of evidence and science to regulation. There's been some progress as well. I was fortunate to be part of a launch event with Professor Sturver and Dr. Derek Joch, who was the former director of the WHO and one of the co-authors of the FCTC. So there's already been some good movement in Reset, including the development of a manifesto. So if I'm correct, there will be a website for Reset in which the manifesto can be regarded and reviewed by those who would like to support this project. And then just lastly, if we want to get to the preferred future with good regulation, in Germany, 5% by 2040 smoking prevalence is the goal. If you look at the UN goal, they would like for non-communicable disease, which is mostly tobacco-related disease, they would like to see a 25% relative reduction in overall mortality from these NCDs. And in tobacco use, they'd like to have a 30% relative reduction in the prevalence of current tobacco use for persons aged 15 or more by 2025. Now, these are extremely aspirational and probably overstated indicators, which is no problem in public health. But just to give you an idea, a reality check of our past performance as a global public is in the 80s, globally, there was only a reduction of 0.4% in smoking prevalence. In the 90s, 1.7%. And between 2006 and 2012, just 0.8%. So it seems like if we want to have such a massive reduction to 5%, that we would need more than just classic orthodox tobacco control policies. We need more. And that's really where we see the role of Reset can help accelerate tobacco harm reduction. To avoid the situation that we have, for instance, if you look at the UK and Australia, the smoking prevalence in the UK, which has a progressive regulatory framework which acknowledges tobacco harm reduction's role, you can see there's a steady decline in the smoking prevalence. Whereas in Australia, where products like e-cigarettes are effectively banned, except available on prescription, you can see that there's a flatlining of prevalence. So what we would like to see is that a Reset should help governments to move towards a more risk-proportionate regulatory environment. Good practice of regulations such as stop smoking campaigns, as there is in the UK, and perhaps for the World Health Organization to rethink their focus on prohibition, where when e-cigarettes were banned in India, the Minister of Health got an award from WHO. We would like all stakeholders are needed, and multi-stakeholder engagement is needed to make sure that risk proportionate sound regulations could be put in place. This also includes some of the billionaires that fund regulatory frameworks like Bloomberg and Gates. They've done fantastic work in other areas of public health, but unfortunately, in terms of tobacco harm reduction, they still have to see the light, especially Mr. Bloomberg, and hopefully he'll do that soon. If he were able to fund programs like Reset, we could have a much better chance of reaching our 5% by 2040. And my last slide is just based on the work of Professor David Levy of Georgetown, who did a study on the US to basically calculate how many deaths would be avoided and how many life years saved if all smokers in the US were to change or switch to e-cigarettes. He did the same for Germany in a preliminary study. And for that, he found that there would be 300,000 deaths avoided and 4.7 million life years saved from 2013 to 2060 if adult cigarette smokers were to change to electronic nicotine delivery systems. So these slides will be made available if you would like to look at this and make sure that the facts are correct. I'm very keen to engage with you. But perhaps just as a last summary and conclusion, Reset, as an old tobacco control veteran, I feel that the work done by Professor Sturver and others in Reset is an important new public health strategy that can be as effective as Empower was for tobacco control. This can accelerate tobacco harm reduction. And obviously, Empower plus Reset is what we want. That can enable us to get to a position where 5% by 2040 isn't a fantasy statement, but can become reality. For that, I thank you very much for the opportunity to engage with you. Thank you, Heino.
Many thanks, Delon, for this comprehensive overview you gave us from, let's say, global efforts of tobacco control. And you are... you have a good overview in many countries of the situation there. Just one question from my side. Do you see, or could you give us some good examples where you can see, let's say, risk proportionate regulations? In Germany, we often point to the UK. Do you think that UK is such an example?
Heino, yes, UK definitely. In terms of the 194 member states of WHO, the UK probably has the most progressive and tobacco harm reduction friendly regulatory framework in the world. But because of Brexit, our hope is that Germany will take over the mantle of a risk proportionate framework in Germany. Coming from the pharma world as well, the key countries in regulation is always the US, Germany, and Japan. And I think in this case, it's also applicable. So we are hoping that Germany, France, some of the other EU nations would follow suit and just focus on building sound, evidence-based regulation that especially recognizes the difference between combustibles and non-combustibles.
Looking back, what would you think, who were the drivers for this, let's say, innovative tobacco control policy in the UK, acknowledging tobacco harm reduction? Who were the drivers, or what was the situation the UK started off?
Health professionals play a disproportionate role. So once health professionals are convinced that this could help prevent disease and prevent premature death, it makes it much easier for politicians to follow suit. So I'd say the key stakeholders are the health professionals. But of late, I'd say that the direct engagement with politicians is extremely important. Because normally we have an indirect approach where we speak to scientists and to health professionals, and they then convince politicians this is the right way forward. But I think increasingly it's very important to engage directly with politicians, just because the political cycle has accelerated so much. So we need to make science understandable and easy to apply for politicians. So I would encourage all of the colleagues on this call to make sure that when they prepare their tobacco harm reduction defense or advocacy or science, that it is palatable for scientists as well and for politicians as well.
Okay. Yeah, that's a good plea, and it's a good recommendation for, let's say, scientists to make their results understandable in a way, and to not ignore, let's say, the scientific basis, as Professor Stork pointed out, that very easily, let's say, in primetime news, let's say, solid data, solid research data have been turned out in a way that is not acceptable.
Exactly.
That was very clear.
Exactly.
Okay. Any questions to Dr. Human? We see in the chat more a comment from Norbert Zillertron-Schmidt. It's not only wrong, it also triggers the teenage rebels to defy death by experimenting with this, thus creating the US vaping epidemic. You mentioned in one of your slides, let's say, the EVALI development, and also you quoted the Sun in, let's say, the headlines. Yeah, would you like to comment on that?
Yes, I think Norbert is absolutely correct. I once asked this to a Director General of the World Health Organization, the previous Director General, what in her view was the most important public health issue that they had to address in non-communicable disease. And this is now for tobacco, alcohol, food, and the rest. And for them, it's always, you start with youth prevention policies. You would want youth not to start smoking, or for that matter, to start vaping. But what you don't want, the youth is not stupid, and you don't want to give them a propaganda line or an ideological phrase instead of the facts. So EVALI was such an incident where e-cigarettes were blamed for something which had absolutely nothing to do with e-cigarettes. It was an adulterated, vitamin E adulterated cannabis vaping device that caused this issue, and it was not anything to do with nicotine vaping products. So for the youth, I hope that we're entering the phase there where they would be accurate and absolute evidence-based information given to all sectors of the society, except especially the youth, so that they have proper risk communication. And I think this is the one lesson that we've all learned from COVID. Is initially there was a lot of miscommunication and misinformation. We should get beyond that. There should be accurate risk communication, especially to the youth.
Okay. Looking at the example with the Sun you mentioned in one of your slides, obviously still in the UK, tobacco harm reduction is still much debated. Is this the case, or is it declining? We're not all experts in the, let's say, public media in the UK. Is it still a debated topic?
I would say that we're approaching the point where it's almost settled science and settled regulation. And what we can now look forward to is to see the steady public health data and understand how that's evolving over time. It's not that it is not being debated, but there are much bigger issues. The kind of hysteria that you see in other countries about vaping, for instance, is not present in the UK anymore. And it's because it's 10 years later. There are sound regulatory structures in place. There's good post-marketing surveillance, not perfect, but in a way in which the society is comfortable with how this has now become a fire escape to adult smokers. That's what you want. You don't want regulators to block the fire escape for adult smokers. And in many countries, especially where non-combustible nicotine alternatives are banned, it's equivalent to blocking the fire escape in a burning room. It makes no sense.
Okay. So many thanks, Delon.
Thank you, Heine.
Stay with us. I know you speak German and you understand German.